All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Dan Piazza. I'm the Chief Philatelic Curator here at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, and it's my very great pleasure this afternoon, it is now officially afternoon, to welcome you to the museum on behalf of Alan Kane, the director, who couldn't be with us this morning, but also all of the museum staff, for the 13th in this series of Maynard Sundman lectures. And we're also very pleased to have with us this morning many of the members and guests of the American First Day Cover Society, who are having their annual convention in Falls Church this weekend. The Maynard Sundman Lecture was established here at the National Postal Museum by his sons, Donald and David, and we're very pleased to have both Don and Dave here with us this morning. And I've asked Dave just to come up and say a few words about his father and the origin of the lecture series.
There's a nice little bio of my dad on the back of the program. He was not a specialized stamp collector, but he really loved stamp collecting and stamp dealing. He was born in 1915 and he was exposed to stamps in 1927, the year that Lindbergh flew to Paris. And right away, a friend of his showed him his grandfather's stamp collection. My father was just amazed at the colors and the shapes and everything. And he kept asking him, where he got those stamps, and often the guy would say, Mystic Stamp Company. And so it's ironic that later we bought Mystic Stamp Company, which was founded in 1923. My dad did make one visit to Washington, and I have a photo of him with my brother Don and in the vault. And he wasn't here, unfortunately, to see the wonderful Gross Gallery be constructed, but he really loved the museum and what it was all about. And Don and I, while Dad was still alive and very active, we decided it would be good to establish this talk so he'd know, how much we respected and regarded his achievements. And so this is the 13th annual, and I'm happy to be here, and it's great to see this great crowd. Thank you.
And just as a side note, all of the previous Maynard Sundman lectures are archived on the museum's website, going all the way back to 2002. So you can go on the Postal Museum's website, postalmuseum.si.edu, and just search Sundman, and you'll find the page with all of the previous Sundman lectures. Hours and hours of philatelic entertainment for you. And then I want to recognize the fact that Don Sundman, who's the chairman of the museum's Council of Philatelists, has arranged for a very special surprise for those of you who are here today. I will not give away right now what it is, but I will say that the program is key. So everyone needs to have a event program, and we'll tell you at the end of the lecture what the special surprise is. So you have to stay to the end of the lecture. Okay, we need a program up front, please. Anybody else need a program? And hang on to it. Don't give it away.
Raise your hand.
Great. Thank you very much. We're very pleased to have as our Sundman lecturer this year, Paul Lee. And Paul's a fascinating guy who had a career trajectory that I think a number of us here would envy. And that is, Paul originally prepared to be a high school biology teacher, and he was a high school biology teacher for a few years. And then in the summers, he took summer jobs with the National Park Service in places like Shenandoah National Park and Rock Creek, and there was a third one. I can't remember what the third one was. Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And after a few years of doing that, I guess Paul said, why am I doing this high school biology teacher thing, and why aren't I just full-time with the National Park Service? And so he did. And Paul had a very long career with the National Park Service as an interpretive planner, which means that when you visit national parks and you see welcome centers, orientation exhibits, media pieces welcoming you to the park and so forth, Paul was responsible for designing and implementing a lot of those in parks all over the United States and even in some of the overseas territories. And Paul's also a practicing stamp collector. He lives in Colorado, and he has an interest in philately and stamp collecting. He volunteers with the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library in Denver, Colorado. And he has married his two passions for stamps and the parks in his collection and now publication called Postmarks and Postmasters, Post Offices Within the National Park System. And it was just such an opportune moment to have Paul come here and deliver the lecture, because the National Postal Museum has its own exhibition on display until March of 2018 for the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, called Trailblazing. And if you haven't seen that, before you leave the museum today, do try and get upstairs and take a look at it. Actually, a number of the parks that Paul will talk about in his presentation are also shown in the exhibition upstairs. And so it was just a wonderful synergy, a great moment to have this lecture on this topic. And we are here actually in the anniversary month. The actual anniversary date for the Park Service is next week, August 25th. So what a great way to celebrate with this lecture. And please join me in welcoming Paul Lee.
Well, thank you. We put together a little video program at the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library that are on the library's website, and one of our members got to read the script for the thing, and he came up to me one day and he said, "Couldn't you have come up with a better title?" He said, "Say this and the subtitle really fast for a show," and boy, you get your tongue tangled in a hurry. So we didn't rename it, though. Well, I'm delighted to be here and to be part of the library's, or the museum's exhibit celebrating the 100th anniversary of the National Park System. And I certainly would like to thank the National Postal Museum and the Sundman family for hosting this event, and I'm just really proud to be a part of it. The talk is based on the book, and it actually began about 8 years ago at the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. We were sitting around, as we do quite often, just sort of shooting the bull and talking about things. And folks knew that I had worked for the National Park System Service, and they said, "Gee, Paul, how many post offices are in the national parks?" So we started rattling off mostly the ones that still exist, like at Grand Canyon and Yosemite and Yellowstone, and a number of all just the national parks, Grand Tetons, for example. But then someone mentioned, well, don't they have one down at the Lincoln's birthplace? And sure enough, they do. They have one in the bookstore, and it's been there since the National Monument was created. Well, that got me to thinking about, gee, I wonder how many there actually are. And then someone from the Colorado Postal History Society said, well, you know, there was one up on Trail Ridge Road in Rocky Mountain National Park. If you've ever, anybody been up there? You're at 13,000 feet on a road that just kind of disappears on both sides. It's kind of a white knuckle drive, but there was a post office there until the 1950s when it finally closed. It was obviously a summer-only post office, but we started rattling all these off, and I figured, gee, there must be an awful lot of them. And so an 8-year research project got started that night, and I quickly realized that, well, you really kind of have to have some criteria. Nice thing about collecting philatelic material, and probably just about anything, is you can always set your own rules. You can use someone else's rules, or you can just invent your own. And so I kind of invented my own. And I picked basically 3 criteria. The first one was I wanted to consider post offices that lie within the authorized boundaries of national park system areas. Not just national parks, but any place. And I'll qualify that in a minute. So an authorized boundary, here's an example. This is from the brochure for agate fossil beds. Actually, agate is mentioned upstairs. And you'll see the dark green line, which indicates, and there's a little one over here, a little piece of property they own that's detached. But that's the authorized boundary, and within that boundary, you'll see a lighter green, sort of a greenish blue color, and that is land that's actually owned and managed by the National Park Service. The white areas on either side, you can see there, if you can read from the back of the room, they're listed as private property, and they indeed are private property. They're privately owned, and anybody that goes on that property needs the owner's permission to do it. But what it also means is that if the owner of any of these properties was willing to sell or donate all or part of the land to the park, that could happen, provided the park, if they were going to purchase it, had the money to do so. So it's sort of a willing buyer, willing seller. So that's basically what the authorized boundary means. And on the one on your left, Agate Springs Ranch, the post office was actually there. It ran from 1899 until 1968, when it was discontinued. That's the fancy word for closed. So that was my first criteria, within the authorized boundary. And you'd think that would be black or white. It's either in or out. And that was really not the case. In many cases, there was an old road that went up, and it actually formed the park boundary, and part of the town was on one side that was maybe in the National Forest area, and the other side of the town was in the National Park area. So where was the post office? So it was things like that that made this really not that crystal clear sometimes. Criteria 2 was I wanted areas managed primarily by National Park Service people, staff. And now that may sound ridiculous. Well, of course, park people manage parks, the national parks. But there are a lot of categories of national park system areas that are really managed by other people. A lot of the national heritage areas, for example, are managed by sometimes many different people, from private landowners to other agencies, state, local, and federal. I used what's known as the Red Book, because it's red. This is an older version, actually, from 2005 to 2007. You can actually get this online now, which is a boon sometimes, and then sometimes it's kind of depressing that you did all this work, and now you can just go online and get it. And not only that, you can get the 2009 to 2011 version for nothing online. But this is the one I used primarily and practically wore it out. It's in 3 parts, an introduction that describes all the different categories of National Park Service land. I used the second section. It's an alphabetical list of all of the areas that are managed by the National Park Service. It's park people, a superintendent or a site manager or somebody like that actually runs the place. The third area are these other areas like Chimney Rock in northwestern Nebraska. It's along one of the historic trails there. It's listed as an affiliated area of the National Park Service, but it's run by the State Park System of Nebraska, so it's not in the book. So that's the first 2. The third one was that it includes both current and former NPS areas. You ever think the Park Service would actually give something up? Well, here's General Grant National Park. Well, there isn't a General Grant National Park anymore. Anybody know what happened to it? You're close. You're very close. Kings Canyon. In 1940, it became Kings Canyon National Park. So we didn't really give it away. We just changed its name in 1940. But this is a little different. Anybody know where this is? I ask this question every time I give a talk like this back in Denver. And they sit and look, and somebody said, gee, is that Union Station? And not the one in Denver, but the one here, right next door, as a matter of fact. In 1976, on July 4th of 1976, it officially became the National Visitor Center. And it was run by the Park Service. Upstairs in the main lobby, there was what was affectionately known as the pit. They dug the floor out, except for a walkway around the edge. They put in an 80-screen projection system. It was a rear screen projection system. You would come in, you could stand on any of these levels and watch a program aimed at getting you to visit the national park areas, service areas in the city. And it was not very successful. Back in the 70s, I was here when all this was being built. I never did get here when it was actually, well, maybe once I got here when it was actually sort of operating. But it wasn't very attractive to people. People didn't want to come. This was not a very nice area of the city back in the 70s. There was a lot of crime, a lot of drugs, and so forth. And a lot of homeless people found these nooks and crannies great places to stay warm and sleep and cuss you out if you disturbed them. And so people just didn't want to come. And the tour companies didn't want to come either for some of the same reasons. So it didn't work for that reason. The other reason was you'll notice these little white specks on the floor. Well, they once came from the ceiling. The building was not in very good shape, and the Park Service did not have enough money, to do all of the maintenance and upkeep and restoration that was called for the building. So because chunks of plaster were falling on visitors, I don't know if any actually did, but there was certainly a threat there. After a few years, the Park Service decided this was not going to work, and they gave it up. And the Department of Transportation took it over and has turned it into what you see today, which looks a little bit better than, in fact, it looks a whole lot better than this. There is a post office over there. I wasn't really sure, but I actually went over there last night and was directed downstairs to, sure enough, there's a postal station there. And there was back in the 70s also, and on Dedication Day, there was a slogan cancel for the opening of the National Visitor Center. So, those were the three criteria. Then the research started, and I really am one who believes in start simple and then follow where it takes you. And sometimes it takes you to some complicated areas. But the simplest thing I knew to start with were these brochures, which are also now available online. People used to collect these on eBay. There were a lot of people who collected brochures, and of course a lot of you probably have a drawer full of them from your travels and so forth, but there's people who actually collect these. But they all have a map inside, and it's a great place to start. Gives you a general idea of how big the park is, and are there any communities in there, former areas, and so you can kind of go from there. And like it said, they're online now, so if you go to nps.gov, there they are. The other great source for research was the National Archives. And fortunately in Denver, Denver has one of the, I think, 9 regional offices, something like that, in the country for the National Archives. And I lived over there when I wasn't doing my own job, and consulted basically 2 records. One were the records of post office applications. When people wanted to set up a post office, now you got to realize there's lots of exceptions to these, they would fill out an application and submit it. And what this tells you, told me, was where these post offices, a little bit more about where they were located. What stream or body of water they might be next to, what intersection of roads they might be close to, what the nearest post office might be, and how far away it was. They also contained a map, at least most of them did, not all of them. Some of the maps are very good. Some looked like they had been drawn by, you know, a 6-year-old kid. And of course, some were adults who also drew like a 6, and this might be an insult to 6-year-old kids, but some of the maps were very useful and some were not in helping determine is this post office inside or outside the current boundaries of the park. The other records were the appointments of postmasters, because I was really curious, who ran these places? Who were they? How long did the post office actually run? So there's a bunch of different records for that. Here's one, for example, that's in the book, a place called Gaskell in Grand County, Colorado. That's in Rocky Mountain National Park. And the former town or community of Gaskell now lies within the park boundary. And it served a bunch of gold mines that were also in the park or near the park at the time. Anybody here know a guy named Bill Bauer? Yeah, Bill was quite a Colorado postal history guy, and I only got to meet him once before he passed away. And somebody introduced him as that I was working on this book. And the first thing he said is, "You got Fairfax?" And I looked at him and said, "Where's that?" And he told me it's very close to Gaskell. It only lasted, and again, I know you can't read all this, but the Fairfax post office only ran for 3 years. It only had one postmaster, and I did discover that it ran out of a cabin, a 2-room cabin. One room was a store with a post office in it, and the other room was where the guy lived. And in 3 years, it was all, well, at least the post office was discontinued. So here's a couple Gaskell covers from one of our members at the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library, actually the Colorado Postal History Association. They're both, one has a manuscript cancel from 1882 for Gaskell, the other has an octagonal stamp cancellation from 1886, and that was the dates 1880 to 1886. And Gaskell only had one postmaster during those 6 years. And this is what it looks like today. In fact, I would say a good 80 to 85% of the post offices in the book look like this. They're gone. They served a function generally long before the park was established for mining, for logging, farming, ranching, whatever it was, and today they're gone. Forms change. This is just, I don't know why I left this one in here, actually. It's just to show how later on, around the 1930s, the forms for appointing postmasters changed and gave a little more information than the early ones. And that's the Trail Ridge Post Office, that one that was at 13,000 feet and closed. It says it closed in, what does it say, December of 1953. Well, I guarantee you it closed in September, early September probably of that year, because the snow would have been as tall as this room. So libraries, great source, and I do want to get in a plug for the library I volunteer for, the Rocky Mountain Philatelic. Anybody from Colorado or been to this library? A few hands go up. Good, good. And it's a great place, not only for the records that are kept here, but also for the people. This fellow right here, he collects national parks, but not stamps, not covers. He visits them, and he keeps a list of all the parks that he visited. And a few years ago, he checked off the last one. although I kind of blew his joy by saying, well, did you go to the one in American Samoa? And he said, no, I went, I think he did Alaska and all of the lower, the continent here. But he got them all. And people really are the key to this. Names and dates and boundary lines and all that is maybe fun for some people and essential. But the people are what are really important. And I got to know a lot of the folks, sometimes literally, sometimes just through records that are left behind, like Maud Holzer, who was the postmaster at Mount McKinley National Park in Alaska. It's now Denali National Park and Preserve, but it's not a post office, it's a postal station. And it's not in this old log cabin anymore. Lee Medley was postmaster of Rush, Arkansas, and that's in the Buffalo National River. And here he is sort of a classic postmaster, old country store. He's sitting there in his bib overalls in front of his stove, reading the paper, and there's the post office window and the boxes behind him. And so many of the post offices were like that in the national parks. Robert Stengel, I met Robert at Manzanar. When he was a young man, he worked for the War Relocation Authority, and he worked with Japanese Americans in the post office at Manzanar. He's now well into his 90s. I'm not even sure if Robert is still living. How many have been to Shenandoah National Park? If you're from around here, that's probably just about anybody. Very popular area, and one of the most popular hikes in Shenandoah is up Old Rag Mountain. And what you don't find out too much about when you go there, other than the fantastic views and the real interesting climb, is that there was a little community there called Old Rag, one word. And William Brown was, again, the only postmaster for Old Rag. And just, here's a married couple, Bert and Anna Mae Hill on Shaw Island, Wisconsin. This is now Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And Bert was the postmaster. They ran together. They ran a place for visitors to stay, fed them, and that was the experience going out on boats at Apostle Islands. Well, to get a little more personal, I ran across, well, here's Dry Tortugas, which some of you may know better as Fort Jefferson. The official name is Dry Tortugas National Park. They expanded the area to include other islands in the general area, and that led to the national park designation. But this is Fort Jefferson. And in my searches, I found a cover. I can't remember where I got it. But it says Fort Jefferson, Florida, March 11th. I figured, well, when? So I look at the stamp, and it's probably Scott number 65. That's just my guess. Some of you probably know far better than me. And that stamp was issued in 1861-62. At least that's how it's listed in the Scott catalog. So that kind of narrows it down. It could be later than that, the actual when it was mailed, but the stamp kind of narrows things down. So I decided to put on my genealogy hat and find out a little more about this. Who's Mrs. Dr. S.G. Morton from Philadelphia, Germantown? Well, I found Dr. Samuel George Morton around that time. Actually, it was earlier then. He died in the early 1950s. He was a craniologist. I don't think there's too many of them around anymore. But that was his profession. But he kind of falls out of the picture here because he's dead by the early 1850s. He's married. His wife's name is, I better make sure I got it right here, Rebecca. His wife's name is Rebecca. So that's the Mrs. Doctor. And their family consisted of a large number of kids, the oldest which was James St. Clair Morton, who was in the Army, at least in 1860. He was an engineer, and his job was going around to the various coastal forts, getting them ready for operation and getting them ready to shoot their artillery. He was transferred to Fort Jefferson in March of 1861. It doesn't say which day. So it could be that our letter was mailed in March. That's assuming he was there in early March and didn't arrive after March 11th. And also, what month was the stamp issued? It was issued in 1861, but when did it come out? So that's kind of unclear. Whoops, I went too far. He's transferred in 1862 in May. He's transferred to Washington, D.C. He's transferred there because he recontracted malaria while at Fort Jefferson. And I don't know why, but the doctors thought he'd be better off in Washington, D.C. You judge that for yourselves. But anyway, he's here in 1862. His mother, then we find out, dies in 1864. Again, it's not really that relevant, although it does establish a date. He wouldn't have addressed a letter to her after that date. And he himself is killed in Petersburg. So apparently he got over his malaria, and he was shipped off to Virginia and ended up in the siege of Petersburg, and he died 6 months after his mother did. So I kind of came to the conclusion that if I were betting on which March 11th, I would probably pick March of 1862, but I'm open for argument on that. It's just like the odds are that he was probably writing his mother to let her know that he was sick and he was being transferred to Washington, but who knows? So a little bit of genealogy comes in. So does sharing information, and I'm sure even with you first day cover folks, sharing information with each other at conferences like you're at, or online, or through emails and so forth. I didn't know this guy existed. It turns out he's got quite a collection of Yellowstone material. He collects Yellowstone, and he claimed to have what he considers the oldest Mammoth Hot Springs cancellation, again, a manuscript cancellation from Yellowstone. And he just without hesitation said, "I'll send you a scan. Tell me how detailed you want it." And I got it in the mail. He said, "Please use it in your book. Just give me a little credit for it." The same is true with Marjorie Sente. She lives in Arizona. She has a magnificent Grand Canyon collection, and you'll see some of her other stuff that she donated to the museum upstairs. She has the only known cancellation from toll-free Arizona, and toll-free was one of the post offices. Again, look at the dates, about 3 years. Was in the Grand Canyon on the south rim. It was basically a campground with tents, but they had a post office, and the toll-free family ran it for a while. Sort of came to a tragic ending, the family anyway, but you can read that in a book. We're going to get to questions here in just a second, but speaking of questions, one of the ones that I get asked a lot is which park has or has the most post offices? What do you think? That's a hint right there. Shout it out. No, not a national park. The body of water is another hint. Okay. New River Gorge, National River, through West Virginia. This portion that lies within the park boundary has, at least from the book, more post offices than any other site. I got something like 56 post offices. This area was very, very rich in coal. And there was a coal mine a mile almost. I mean, there were just so many coal companies. The only way through, and you can sort of see a road cut on the left-hand side of the river, it's a railroad. It's the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and that was really the only way to get through the New River Gorge. But all of the post offices along the river, and just about every coal company had their own post office, relied on that railroad to get the mail in and out. Of course, they got the coal in and out too. Or in a few cases, the timber, because there were a few timber companies in there too. But 56 of them. And I don't know if I got them all. Whoops, I went the wrong way. Most of the there's a few post offices too that still run. And if you travel Amtrak on that line, you can go to a couple of them that are still Prince, West Virginia. The old Prince store still has a post office that operates. This was Thurmond, West Virginia, and it closed about 6 years ago. And the building still stands. I think somebody took the flag down finally, but that was the post office right next to the tracks. Another Gaskell, only this was McKendree, West Virginia. It had a post office, pretty bad cover, the only one I've ever found. And I think it's 1916. And it's about all you find in most of these places are things that didn't decay very fast. All right, wrapping it up. There's some weird ones. Where's this? Somebody said it, I think. The Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite National Park. Swank place, nice place. If you'd been there in 1941 to 45, thereabouts, the lobby would look like this. It was being used as a Navy convalescent hospital, and I think there's more about that upstairs too. And it did have a post office, and I think they have one up there too. And at the end of the war, the hospital closed down. They put the stuff back. Took them about a year or two to get everything straightened up and opened up to the public again. But that's what the Ahwahnee was during World War II. So was Fort McHenry, but that was World War I. Fort McHenry in Baltimore was sort of the same deal. And another one, just kind of ending this on a sad note, I suppose. Some people collect crash mail. Airplanes crash and have crashed since they started airmail. And sometimes they find the remains and sometimes they don't. This was a transcontinental and Western Air flight from San Francisco to Winslow, Arizona, and it crashed on a mountain in Yosemite National Park. It took them about 4 days to find the site. All lives were lost on the flight, but they did find a mail sack, and the mail was fairly damaged, so they took it to the main Yosemite post office, and there the mail was sorted through, repairs were made, these seals were applied, and the mail was then sent on its way. One of our members at the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library purchased this and again gave me scans to use in the book. So that's it. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm honored that I was selected to be part of this really great lecture series, and I hope I've given you some insights to resources you probably won't hear too much about in the national parks when you visit them, and rightly so, because most of these places were set aside for far greater reasons than the fact that there was a post office there at one time. But it's part of the story, and I thought it would be fun to tell. So thank you for coming.
you can stay here because we do have time for some questions.
Oh, okay.
If you're willing to take some
I
questions.
am, yeah. Over here.
As the parks don't have static boundaries, how difficult is it to trace them through history to see whether they incorporated a post office or not at one time or another?
It's not terribly easy. In fact, I worked at Shenandoah National Park twice, once as a seasonal and then again as permanent ranger for a number of years. My first two kids were born in Shenandoah National Park. Shenandoah National Park has a law or something. Anyway, they cannot purchase any more land. It's written, they cannot buy more land. But they can trade, and it still happens. If you look at the boundary of Shenandoah, it's just, just looks like spaghetti. Goes way out in the valley in some areas. In other cases, it's not much wider than Skyline Drive. But, so they can trade with a willing trader. They can, and that happens. So you never know, you might put something like this in a book, and it's in the park. And a couple of years down the road, piece got traded, and now it's not. So it's a thing that's very much in flux, and it's hard to determine. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was there ever a post office on Isle Royal in Mexico?
Yeah, there's several, as a matter of fact. A lot of the fish camps had a post office at one time, and I don't know if the one still exists or not. There was one at Rock Island. I don't think it exists anymore. I don't think they have one. And it would have only been a seasonal one anyway, since the park's closed part of the year. But several of the fish camps had a post office for their, and a lot of the fish camps also doubled as tourist recreational fishing, so they had tourists there. So you'll see in the book that there's a number of post offices listed for Isle Royal. Yeah.
I noticed you selected the 4-cent Mesa Verde National Park stamp issued under FDR. The first set, I wonder if you're aware of the problem of Mesa Verde and Merida Quarter reverse in the current, commemorative quarter series. The governor died in Colorado, and he originally figured Mesa Verde, his wife took over as temporary governor and decided to go with colorful Colorado. So
Yeah.
put it on the regular Colorado quarter.
Mhm.
Then the Park Service, I guess, came up with dunes. The national, park of dunes in southeast Colorado became the coin that they went with. And only one could be issued per state
Huh.
with the, commemorative reverse for the quarter. So I recommended the coinage committee, they put it on the reverse of the $1 coin with Santa Maria on the obverse, papoose.
Mhm.
And then every year they change it. But they've reached like 1 billion coins. Most of them sit in the treasury. They're unused so
Mhm.
far. But I wondered if you have any impact. Maybe you could down Mesa Verde placed on the reverse of that dollar coin. It's only good for 1 year.
Yeah.
The mintage is minimal.
Uh-huh.
So it would be an interesting facet, sort of combining the 4-cent stamp and the quarter reverse.
Uh-huh.
Also, I noticed the quarter designs of the reverses are not up in the national parks. The stamp was in Mesa Verde. They've got a hugely large one up on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered why not have the quarter reverses, a model can be made as big as a quarter can be. The coin, of course, is minutiae, then it could be beautiful.
Yeah.
Each national park is a chance to remember it that way.
Good point. I would add that Mesa Verde and, does Crater Lake still have one that's open?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought so. They are on the bubble. Every year, every time people start discussing closing post offices, those two pop up. And for some reason, they've hung on and they've managed to keep their post offices open. But it may be in our lifetime yet when we see those go by the way. But that's just an aside from what you were saying.
What a number of the parks have done to keep their post office open is they convert them to contract postal units run by the cooperating association, like Eastern National or whoever runs their friends group or they're attached to the park, and that's how a number of them have kept them open. Yeah.
Okay.
Any final questions? Yes.
So, just wondering, what is the northernmost post office in the national park? Would it be in the gates of the Arctic?
That was what popped in my mind first. Gates of the Arctic has a post office. Anaktuvik Pass, does that sound familiar? Anaktuvik Pass is only accessible by plane, but there are people who live there. There are Native Americans who live there, and then there's a park ranger or two that lives there, and they have a post office, and they're very happy to send you one if you want a cancellation from there. They probably don't have too much mail to deliver, but yeah, there's that. I would say that's the northernmost. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so now to the treat that I promised you at the beginning of the lecture. Don Sundman has very kindly provided a number of copies of Paul Lee's book that will be distributed at random to you if, on the back of your program, you find a red dot in the lower corner of your program. If you find the red dot, come on up and collect your book. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming. And the AFDCS meeting will continue in the Discovery Center.
I think they all are assigned, but yeah.